I remember the first time I saw the chains. Not the heavy Dura-Steel kind you imagine when you think of slavery, I know. Those would have been honest, visible, something you could point to and say, this is wrong. The chains I wore were golden. Literally. Rhodium-plated binders that caught the neon light of Nar Shaddai's eternal night and threw it back in fragmented rainbows across the walls of the counting house. They were beautiful. That was the point. The Hutts understand something fundamental about control that most slavers never grasp. If you make the cage lovely enough, the trapped thing stops trying to escape and starts trying to deserve its place inside. I was 11 standard years old when they fitted those first binders on my wrists. The metal was warm. They heated it slightly, I learned later. So the first sensation wasn't cold shock, but something almost comforting, like being held. The Quarren who fastened them had surprisingly gentle hands. He smelled like spice and ocean brine, and he hummed something while he worked, a tune I still can't identify. When he finished, he tilted my chin up with one webbed finger and said in accented basic, "Pretty thing, you'll do well here. Just remember, the Hutts feed those who smile." I smiled. I was good at smiling. It's the first skill you learn. The counting house sat in the mid-levels of the Corellian sector, wedged between a body mod parlor and a warehouse that processed synthetic proteins into something vaguely edible. You could hear the hum of the processing equipment through the walls at all hours, a low, grinding vibration that got into your bones and stayed there. At night, when the district's pulse shifted from commercial desperation to recreational desperation, the bass from the club 3 floors down would join that hum, creating a rhythm that sounded almost biological, like being inside some massive creature's digestive tract, which, in a way, we were. Nar Shaddai is a moon that eats people. Everyone knows this. It consumes them and processes them and excretes them into the void, and the Hutts are the digestive system that makes it all work. They sit at the center of it, vast and patient and utterly indifferent to the distinction between commerce and predation. To a Hutt, these are the same thing. There is only appetite, and the systems built to satisfy appetite, and the organic resources consumed in service of both. I was an organic resource. My designation was RA 4477K. The RN indicated I belonged to the Royal Hutt network and not actual royalty. That was just branding, and the number sequence identified my contract holder, my purpose category, and my acquisition date. The K meant I was Kundali processed, which is to say I'd been purchased through legal channels with documented transaction records. Not kidnapped, not stolen, not claimed as debt collateral. Boss. My mother had sold me for 8,000 credits and a cancellation of her obligation to the Spice Den where she worked. I don't blame her for this. 8,000 credits was more money than she'd ever held in her hands, and the obligation would have killed her within a year. She chose to survive. I was the currency that purchased her survival. This is what the Hutts understand better than anyone. Everything is currency. Freedom is currency. Dignity is currency. Hope is currency. Pain is currency. And like any sophisticated economic system, their control relies not on the simple exchange of one thing for another, but on complex instruments of leverage, dependency, and manufactured need. The first manufactured need is chemical. They didn't give me the spice immediately. That would have been crude, and the Hutts are never crude in their methods. Instead, they established routine. For the first 3 months, I lived in a dormitory with 17 other children, all of us newly acquired, all of us still adjusting to our golden chains. We were taught basic if we didn't speak it, taught mathematics suitable for accounting work, taught the various Huttese dialects used in different criminal enterprises. We learned to recognize the emblems of different cartel families, the hierarchy of their enforcers, the proper forms of address. We learned to move quietly, to keep our eyes down, but our attention sharp, to become invisible when necessary and present when required. And every morning with our meal, we received a small cup of dark liquid. It tasted like burnt calf mixed with something sweet and unidentifiable. They called it kava. We called it breakfast. I was 4 months into my service before I realized the kava contained glitter stem derivatives. Not enough to cause euphoria. Nothing so obvious. Just enough to create a mild dependence, a slight discomfort in its absence, a vague sense of unease that disappeared when you drank it. Just enough that missing breakfast left you irritable and unfocused, made your hands shake slightly, made the counting house's hums seem more invasive. Just enough that you looked forward to that cup with an anticipation that felt like your own preference but wasn't. One. This is the genius of it. The control doesn't announce itself. It creeps in through tiny repetitions, through small reliefs of small discomforts, until the boundary between your will and your programming dissolves completely. The counting house where I worked belonged to Gorga the Hutt, a mid-level cartel administrator who specialized in entertainment district protection schemes. Not the violent kind of protection, had enforcers for that, but the financial architecture that made the violence possible. We processed payment streams from hundreds of establishments: cantinas, gambling dens, pleasure houses, fighting pits. Every transaction was recorded, every percentage calculated, every discrepancy noted. The numbers flowed through us like water through pipes, and we were the pipes, unthinking and essential. My station was in the 3rd row, 4th position. I sat on a repulsor cushion that never quite adjusted to my weight correctly, in front of a datapad that had been old when the Clone Wars ended. The screen flickered if you looked at it wrong. The input stylus was worn smooth where thousands of fingers had gripped it before mine. Around me, 43 other processors sat at identical stations, styluses moving in rhythm, the soft tapping creating a sound like rain. We worked 12-hour shifts. The first 6 hours were focused on transactions required accuracy, and mistakes were noted. The second 6 hours were when exhaustion set in, when the numbers began to blur together, when your mind started to drift, and you had to force it back to the columns, the calculations, the endless verification of other people's wealth. During these hours, they gave us stims. Again, nothing obvious. Just small tablets we could request from the floor supervisor if we felt our attention flagging. They were presented as a kindness, a tool to help us perform our duties better. And they worked. The exhaustion would lift, the numbers would sharpen, and you could push through to the end of your shift with mechanical efficiency. I learned later that the stims contained a mild euphoric, just enough to create positive association with the work. Just enough that the act of processing transactions, of serving the Hutt's interests, began to feel satisfying in itself. Your brain started to connect the completion of tasks with small releases of pleasure, until the work itself became a need, and its absence a source of anxiety. Layer by layer, they built the dependency. The kava for physical stability. The stims for emotional regulation. And beneath both, the ever-present threat of their withdrawal. I saw what happened to those who lost access. There was a Rhodian in my processing group named Tico. He was older than most of us, maybe 15 standard years, and he'd been in the counting house since he was 7. He knew the system better than anyone, could process payment streams faster than the supervisors could verify them, never made mistakes. He was, by any measure, a perfect slave. Then he got sick. Not seriously sick, just a respiratory infection common in Nar Shaddah's recycled air, the kind of thing that would resolve itself in a week with rest and basic medicine. But he couldn't work. For 6 days he lay in the dormitory while his body fought the infection. And for 6 days he received no kava, no stims, nothing but water and nutrition paste. When he returned to his station, he lasted 40 minutes before the tremors started. I watched from my position as his hands began to shake, gently at first, then violently. He tried to hold the stylus steady, but it clattered against the datapad, leaving random marks across his work. Sweat appeared on his forehead. darkening his skin to deep emerald. He made a sound, low in his throat, like an animal trying not to whimper. The floor supervisor was a weekay named Skorg. He'd been kind to me once, showing me a trick for processing split payments more efficiently. He walked over to Tico's station with his usual unhurried pace, observed for exactly 10 seconds, then made a gesture to the guards stationed by the door. They removed Tico from the counting house. We heard him screaming in the corridor outside for almost 3 minutes, screams that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the sudden catastrophic absence of chemicals his body now required to function. Then silence. He came back 2 weeks later. He never spoke again, just sat at his station and processed numbers with mechanical precision, his eyes empty as scratched transparent steel. Whatever they'd done to him during those 2 weeks had burned out something essential. He'd become what the huts needed most, a perfectly obedient biological machine. I made sure to never miss my morning kava, but the chemical dependency, sophisticated as it was only the first chain. The huts layer their controls, creating redundancy systems that ensure if one mechanism fails, 6 others remain intact. The second chain was economic. Despite being slave-saw, property, legally speaking, with no more rights than a cargo crata, we were paid. Not much. A tiny stipend credited to individual accounts, just enough to purchase small comforts from the commissary. Better food than the standard paste. Itiwa. Entertainment attachips. D&or. Cosmetics. Clothing that wasn't the uniform gray jumpsuit we received as basic issue. The amounts were carefully calculated. Too little, and slaves might despair, might give up, might become useless. Too much, and they might see a path to eventual freedom. The stipend we received was precisely calibrated to provide hope without possibility. And there were deductions. Your binders needed maintenance? That cost money, deducted from your account. You required medical treatment? I deducted. You needed to replace a damaged uniform? Deducted. The bunk you slept in, the water you drank, the air you breathed, all of it calculated, all of it measured, all of it extracting value from the tiny stream of income they provided. I never saw my account balance reach more than 47 credits. And freedom, when I bothered to check the markets where such things were traded, cost approximately 300,000. The mathematics of hopelessness. The huts were very good at mathematics. But even this wasn't the cruelest part. The cruelest part was the loans. You could borrow against your future earnings. The rate was reasonable, only 30% interest, compounded monthly. And the things you could buy with borrowed money were so tempting. Better quarters, better food, time off, access to the mid-level commercial districts where slaves were technically allowed to walk freely, as long as their tracking implants remained active and they returned by curfew. A Twi'lek girl in my dormitory named Silene borrowed 200 credits to purchase a visit to her sister, who worked in a pleasure house 6 sectors away. She hadn't seen her in 3 years. The visit lasted 4 hours. Those 4 hours cost her an additional 18 months of servitude once the interest was calculated. She never regretted it. That was the terrible thing. She'd smile sometimes lying in her bunk, remembering those 4 hours, and she'd say it was worth it. The huts had sold her a memory and charged her future for it, and she'd made the trade willingly. This is the second thing the huts understand. Debt is more powerful than chains. Chains you can see, can test for weakness, can imagine breaking. Debt is invisible and grows in the dark, and by the time you understand its shape, it's already grown too large to escape. The third chain was social. The counting house operated on a hierarchy. At the bottom were the new acquisitions, the unproven, the ones still learning their functions. Above them were the experienced processors, like me, who demonstrated reliability and accuracy. Above us were the senior processors, who'd earned small privileges through years of service. Above them were the shift supervisors, slaves who'd been granted limited authority over their fellow slaves. And above them were the free employees, the accountants, managers, and enforcers who actually worked for the hut, rather than being owned by him. The hierarchy created aspiration. You could see the person one level above you, could observe their slightly better conditions, their marginally increased freedoms. And you could believe that with enough obedience, enough performance, enough time, you might ascend. Some did. Tico, before his illness, had been on track for supervisor status. There was a human named Jace, who'd started as a processor and eventually earned enough favor to be granted a paid position. Still trapped, still controlled, but no longer property. He could leave the counting house. Well, he could keep his earnings. He could even, theoretically, save enough to buy passage off-world, though no one actually believed he would. The system created the illusion of meritocracy. Work hard enough, obey completely enough, and you might escape. Except the standards for advancement were never quite clear, never quite achievable, always just beyond reach. You'd perform flawlessly for months, hoping for recognition, only to watch someone else receive the promotion you'd earned, for reasons that were never explained. And this created the fourth chain: competition. We weren't united. We couldn't afford to be. Every privilege granted to another slave was a privilege denied to you. Every favor, every advancement, every slight improvement in conditions saw. All of it was finite. All of it had to be competed for. I learned to notice when a fellow processor made mistakes. Learned to quietly report them to supervisors. Learned that my own advancement often came at the direct cost of someone else's demotion. Learned to feel satisfaction when a rival was transferred to worse duties, even as I hated myself for feeling it. The Huts had built a system where the oppressed policed each other, where slaves competed for the privilege of slavery, where the desperate would betray the desperate for fractional improvements in unbearable conditions. And it worked. It worked perfectly. I spent 3 years at that datapad, processing other people's money, watching the numbers scroll past in endless columns, my fingers moving with practiced efficiency, my mind drifting through chemical-mediated focus. The golden chains around my wrists became as familiar as my own skin. I stopped noticing them. New? The Hut himself, Gorga, I saw perhaps a dozen times in those 3 years. He would arrive at the counting house in a repulsor sled, massive and ancient, his skin mottled green and brown, his eyes small and calculating beneath heavy lids. The smell preceded him, a mixture of perfumed oils and underlying decay that no amount of scent could fully mask. He would survey the rows of processors with the same expression a merchant might use to assess inventory, occasionally making comments in Huttis to his major domo, a Doug named Rilix, who translated everything with elaborate politeness. Once, Gorga's gaze fell directly on me. I felt it like a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders, making it difficult to breathe. I kept my eyes on my work, kept my stylus moving, demonstrated perfect obedience. After a moment, he moved on, and I released breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That night, I received a notification. My efficiency rating had increased by 0.3%. My stipend would reflect this improvement. I felt pride at this news, felt genuine happiness at being noticed, at being valued, even minutely, by the vast entity that owned me. This was perhaps the most sophisticated chain of all. They made you complicit in your own enslavement. They made you seek approval from your oppressor. They made you internalize their measurements of your worth until you began to measure yourself by the same standards, until being a good slave became a source of genuine satisfaction. The human mind will adapt to anything if given no alternative. It will find meaning in meaningless tasks, will create hierarchy in hell, will feel pride in surviving unlivable conditions. The Huts didn't just trap Bodhisattva, they trapped consciousness itself, bent it, reshaped it, made it a tool for its own subjugation. But there were fractures in the system. There had to be. No control structure is perfect, and the huts, for all their sophistication, could not account for every variable. The first fracture appeared in my 4th year, when they transferred me to off-site duties. This was presented as a promotion. My accuracy scores had remained consistently high, my behavior exemplary, my attendance perfect. I'd become one of the reliable ones, which meant I could be trusted with more complex tasks, which meant more exposure to the cartel's actual operations. Once per week, I was escorted to various establishments in Gorga's portfolio to perform on-site audits. A Garda, usually a Nikto enforcer named Verka, would collect me from the counting house, lead me through Nar Shadda's labyrinthine corridors, and deliver me to whatever cantina or gambling den or pleasure house needed its books verified. The stated purpose was efficiency. The actual purpose, I gradually understood, was surveillance. I wasn't just checking numbers. I was observing operations, noting irregularities, identifying potential theft or skimming by establishment owners. I was the hut's eyes in places he was too large to go, recording everything with the perfect memory of the desperate, who know their value depends on their usefulness. But in moving me through the city, they'd given me something dangerous: context. Inside the counting house, the universe was numbers. Transactions abstracted from their source, wealth divorced from the actions that generated it. 100 credits from a cantina looked exactly like 100 credits from a body mod parlor, just data flowing through the system. Outside, I saw where the numbers came from. I saw the gambling dens where humans and aliens and droids fed their money into machines designed to provide just enough reward to maintain hope and just enough loss to ensure profit. I saw the spice parlors where customers inhaled death in measured doses, their eyes glazing with temporary escape from lives they couldn't otherwise endure. I saw the fighting pits where slaves different from me only in purpose, tore each other apart for the entertainment of crowds who wagered on their suffering. I saw, in short, that the system didn't just consume me. It consumed everyone. The seemingly free patrons in these establishments were just as trapped, just different mechanisms of control. They worked meaningless jobs to earn credits to spend on temporary relief from the meaninglessness, generating profit for the huts, who owned the jobs and the relief both. The entire economy was a closed loop, extracting value from suffering and converting it into hut wealth. This understanding should have radicalized me. Should have made me angry. Should have made me want to resist, to fight, to break something. Instead, it made me tired. Because what was the alternative? The huts had been doing this for thousands of years. Their system spanned sectors, involved trillions of beings, ran on infrastructure older than most governments. What could I, one enslaved child with golden chains and chemical dependencies and 47 credits to my name, possibly do against that? So, I did nothing. I continued my duties. I processed the numbers, performed the audits, took my kava each morning and my stims each afternoon, and tried not to think about the implications of any of it. But the universe doesn't care what you try not to think about. It proceeds regardless, and sometimes it forces you to witness things that can't be ignored. The second fracture appeared on a routine audit at a mid-level pleasure house called the Velvet Lash. The establishment was nicer than most I'd visited, cleaner, better maintained, with actual artwork on the walls instead of holographic projections. The clients were mostly mid-level administrators and successful merchants, people with enough money for quality, but not enough for true luxury. The workers were the usual mix of species: Twi'leks, humans, Zeltrons, a few Thelan, all of them beautiful in the specific way that pleasure slaves are beautiful, which is to say maintained and displayed rather than genuinely seen. I was there to verify payroll discrepancies. The house's revenue had declined 3% over the previous quarter, but its reported staffing costs had increased. Gorga suspected the owner, a Faline named Zavar, of skimming by inflating payroll and pocketing the difference. Verk stationed himself near the entrance, while I was given access to Zavar's office, a surprisingly austere room containing little more than a desk, a safe, and a view of Nar Shadda's endless vertical cityscape through a narrow window. I ran the numbers, checked the staff roster against payment records. I cross-referenced with work schedules. The discrepancy became clear within an hour. Zavar was reporting 6 more workers than actually existed, pocketing their ghost wages. Standard fraud. D. I noted it in my report. Case closed. Moo. But as I was preparing to leave, Zavar himself entered the office. He was tall, green-skinned, with the natural grace that Falim possess, and the cold calculation in his eyes that successful criminals develop. Dia? He looked at me, at my golden chains, at my datapad, and smiled without warmth. Find what you were looking for? He asked in accented basic. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. The audit is complete. My report will be filed with Gorga the Hutt within the hour. Of course it will. He moved to the window, looking out at the city. Do you know what the punishment is for skimming from a hut? I did. Everyone did. But I said nothing. They don't kill you, he continued. That would be wasteful. Instead, they adjust you, make you an example. Make it clear to everyone else that theft is more expensive than obedience. He turned back to me. How much do you think they'll take? My hands? My accounts? My establishment? I don't make those determinations, I said quietly. No, you just report them. He walked closer, and I instinctively took a step back. Do you know why I skimmed? I didn't answer. 3 of my workers got sick. Gosh, when you do. Same respiratory thing that's been going around the lower levels. They couldn't work, so I lost revenue. But the hut's take doesn't decrease just because my workers are sick. His percentage stays the same, so I was short. I could either skim to cover the difference, or I could fail to pay, and failing to pay. He made a gesture that suggested consequences beyond words. That's not my concern, I said, though my voice came out less steady than I'd intended. No. Your concern is your next cup of kava. Your concern is your processing quota. Your concern is not ending up like that Rhodian who came back wrong. He smiled again, bitter and knowing. We're all slaves here, girl. The only difference is some of us still remember we're supposed to be angry about it. Mal. Merc appeared in the doorway then, summoned by some instinct for potential conflict. Zavar backed away, raised his hands in a gesture of compliance, and I left the office with my report complete and my mind churning with thoughts I hadn't asked for. They took his hands 3 days later, had them replaced with cheap prosthetics that functioned adequately but hurt constantly, a permanent reminder of the cost of theft. He kept his establishment, kept his position, kept generating profit for Gorga. The hut wasn't interested in punishment for its own sake, only in maintaining the system's integrity. But what haunted me wasn't what happened to Zavar. It was what he'd said. We're all slaves here. Because he was right. The huts didn't just control through chains and chemicals and debt. They controlled through the fundamental structure of the economy itself. They'd created a system where even those who appeared free were trapped, where every participant was complicit, where the only choice was the manner of your servitude. The third fracture appeared slowly, over months, in the form of a story that spread through the counting house in whispers. Somewhere on Nar Shaddaa, someone was buying slaves and freeing them, not stealing them all. That would have been treated as property theft and hunted aggressively. Actually purchasing them, legally, through proper channels, at fair market value, and then simply releasing them from their contracts. No conditions, no obligations, just freedom. The story was absurd. No one did that. There was no profit in it, no point, no possible motivation that made sense within the economic logic that governed everything. But the story persisted. A weekway dock worker bought and freed. A Rhodian cook bought and freed. A human child bought and freed, sent to some religious mission in the upper levels with a stipend to cover 5 years of living expenses. The numbers were small, maybe a dozen confirmed cases over 6 months. But in an economy built on slavery, even small exceptions were dangerous. They suggested that freedom was possible, that someone cared, that the system wasn't absolute. The Hutts investigated, of course, tried to identify the buyer, to determine their purpose, to assess whether this was a threat or just an expensive eccentricity. But whoever was doing this had resources and was careful. The purchases went through multiple intermediaries. The money came from accounts that dissolved after each transaction. The freed slaves were scattered across the moon, given false identities, helped to disappear. And we in the counting house heard about it and felt something we'd almost forgotten. Possibility. It was dangerous, that feeling. It made the work harder, the chains heavier, the routine more unbearable. Before, we'd adapted because we had no choice. Now, we had proof that choice existed somewhere, for someone, and we weren't among the chosen. I started calculating. How much would I cost? 300,000 for basic freedom. But that was just contract termination. To actually disappear? To establish a new identity? To leave the moon entirely? Probably 500,000. More than I would earn in 10 lifetimes. But possible. Theoretically possible. And that changed everything. The fourth fracture was internal. A slow erosion of the certainty that had made obedience survivable. I was 15 standard years old, had been in the counting house for 4 years, had processed billions of credits through my station. I was good at my job. More than good, I was one of the top performers, consistently recognized, occasionally rewarded with small privileges. I'd become exactly what the Hutts wanted. Efficient, obedient, chemically dependent, economically trapped, and socially complicit in my own enslavement. But I'd also started noticing things. The way Skorg, the floor supervisor, would sometimes pause at certain transactions, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly before he approved them. The way certain accounts would show regular deposits that matched no legitimate business activity. The way money flowed not just up to the Hutts, but sideways through networks that the official books didn't acknowledge. I was watching crime finance crime, watching the cartel's official operations fund its unofficial ones, watching wealth extracted from desperate people flow toward purposes even darker than the extraction itself. And I started making a copy. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would trigger audit flags. Just small notations in my personal files, tracking the patterns I noticed. Account numbers, transaction sequences, timing anomalies. I didn't know what I was going to do with this information. Wow. I just knew that I was documenting something true that the system preferred to keep hidden. This was probably the most dangerous thing I'd ever done. Not because the consequences were worse than any other violation, they weren't, but because it meant I'd started thinking of myself as separate from the system. Started thinking of my observations as something to preserve rather than something to forget. Started thinking, in other words, like I still had agency. The fifth fracture was human. His name was Kale. He was transferred to the counting house in my 5th year, a new acquisition, 18 standard years old, human, with the kind of casual competence that suggested education before enslavement. He was assigned to a station 2 rows in front of mine, and from the first day, he was wrong. Not wrong in his work, he processed accurately, kept pace, caused no issues. Wrong in his attitude. He didn't have the defeated posture most new slaves developed within weeks. He made eye contact. He asked questions. He acted, in subtle ways, like he didn't believe this was permanent. I'd not to notice him. Noticing people made you vulnerable, created attachments that would inevitably cause pain when the system inevitably destroyed them. But he noticed me. It started in the meal hall, where we had 15 minutes to consume our evening ration. He sat across from me without asking permission, set down his tray and said, "You've been here a while." Not a question. I nodded, kept eating. How long? 5 years. And you're... He gestured at me. at the chains, at the context. This is normal for you now. This is reality, I said flatly. Normal doesn't apply. He smiled, and it was the strangest thing. It wasn't a slave smile, that careful expression of compliance we all cultivated. It was genuine, almost amused, like he found something funny in the horror. Reality is what we make it, he said. Then you're going to have a very difficult time here. But he didn't. No, sir. Or rather he did, but he didn't break. They gave him the kava, and he drank it but commented that it tasted chemically altered. They gave him the stims, and he used them but noted their effects with clinical detachment. They created all the normal pressures, all the normal dependencies, and somehow he remained aware of them, remained separate from them. He was, I gradually realized, the most dangerous kind of slave, one who remembered he was a person. We started talking. Small conversations at first, nothing that would draw attention. He'd comment on the work, on the counting house's operations, on small absurdities in the system. I'd respond with the practical cynicism I'd developed, explaining why resistance was pointless, why adaptation was survival. And he'd listen, and nod, and then say something that made the pointlessness seem less absolute. You track patterns, he observed one evening. I've watched you. You see things. Seeing doesn't matter, I said. The huts see everything. That's their job. But you keep notes. I froze. No, I'd been so careful. How on? I keep notes too. He smiled, that genuine smile. Did you know there's a Republic holdout cell in the Duro sector? Small, barely functional, but active. They help people disappear sometimes. That's suicide to even mention. I whispered, looking around to see if anyone had heard. Maybe. Or maybe it's a possibility. He leaned closer. The mystery buyer? The one freeing slaves? I think it's them. I think they're building something. Building what? An alternative. A way out. I should have reported him. That's what a good slave would do. That's what the system required. What my survival demanded. Instead, I said, even if that's true, we can't reach them. Not yet, he agreed. But systems have vulnerabilities. The huts are sophisticated. But sophistication creates complexity, and complexity creates opportunity. He was insane. He had to be. You couldn't think like this and survive. But I wanted him to be right. Oh, so. The sixth fracture was violence. It came during a routine audit at a spice den in the lower levels. I was there to verify production costs. The den processed raw spice into consumable forms, cut it with additives, packaged it for distribution. Standard operation? But when I arrived, something was wrong. The den was too quiet. The usual chemical haze was there, the usual smell of processed narcotics, but the workers were absent, the equipment idle. Burke, my guard, sensed it too. His hand went to his blaster, and he moved ahead of me, checking the processing rooms one by one. We found them in the third room. 6 workers, all dead, all still at their stations. No visible injuries. Moo. No signs of struggle. Just stopped. That batch, Burke said after a moment, his voice carefully neutral. Happens sometimes. Fumes get concentrated, people breathe too much. But I was looking at the numbers on the terminal. Production had been running continuously for 48 hours straight. No breaks. No shift changes. The workers had been locked in, forced to process without rest, until the accumulated exposure killed them. This needs to be reported, I said quietly. It will be. As an industrial accident. Burke gestured back toward the exit. Your audit is complete. 6 people died because 6 slaves died because they were processing spice and encountered an occupational hazard, he interrupted, and his voice was harder now. That's what gets reported. That's what gets noted. You want to add something different? I looked at the bodies. Looked at my data pad. Looked at the golden chains on my wrists. No, I said. Nothing different. We left. I filed the report. Industrial accident. No fault assigned. Production resumed the next day with replacement workers. The den's owner received a minor citation for safety protocol violations and paid a small fine. And I learned that death itself was just another cost in the system, factored into the economics like any other expense. The seventh fracture was addiction. Not my gnaw. I'd managed to maintain my dependency at functional levels, using the kava and stims exactly as provided, never exceeding, never requesting more. But Silene, the Twi'lek who'd borrowed to visit her sister, had started spiraling. It began with small things. She'd miss morning kava and beg for extra at lunch. She'd request stims more frequently, claiming focus issues. She'd spend her entire stipend at the commissary on anything that provided a moment's escape: a cheap liquor, recreational chem patches, data chips with recorded sensation programs. She was trying to make life bearable through chemical adjustment, and the Hutts encouraged this. They sold her everything she wanted, at prices calibrated to keep her in perpetual debt, in perpetual need, in perpetual dependence. I watched her waste away. Watched her work quality decline. Watched her fall behind on her obligations, incurring penalties, sliding deeper into a hole she would never climb out of. And I couldn't help her. Well, helping her would require resources I didn't have. Would create a debt I couldn't afford. Would mark me as someone who created problems rather than solving them. So I did nothing. Like everyone else, I did nothing. She collapsed at her station one afternoon during the 8th hour of shift. Just stopped working, slumped forward, stylus falling from her hand. The medical team arrived within minutes. Slaves were expensive to replace, so basic healthcare was provided. But it wasn't a medical issue. It was exhaustion. It was malnutrition. It was the accumulated cost of trying to survive the unsurvivable through chemical means. They revived her, stabilized her, adjusted her medications, and charged her for all of it, adding another year to her contract. When she returned to work 3 days later, she looked hollow. Not broken like Tico had been broken. That would have required intervention, treatment that altered the mind. Just empty. Like she'd finally understood the mathematics and realized that the equation would never balance in her favor. She worked her shifts. She took her kava. She stopped buying anything from the commissary. She stopped talking. I tried once to engage her, asked if she was all right, received no response. Just that empty gaze, those dead eyes that had seen the shape of the trap and stopped struggling against it. 2 months later, she walked off one of the mid-level platforms. They found her body in the lower industrial sectors, 3 kilometers down, broken against machinery that never stopped running. The official report called it an accident, a slave wandering too close to an unguarded edge, a tragic but preventable incident that resulted in minor citations for the platform's safety manager. Everyone knew it wasn't an accident. Everyone knew she'd chosen to leave the only way the system allowed. And everyone went back to work, because what else could we do? The 8th fracture was revelation. Kale had been in the counting house for 8 months when he told me he had a plan. No. We were in a maintenance corridor during a brief break, one of the few places not actively monitored. I'd followed him there with the sick certainty that he was about to get us both killed, but also with the desperate hope that he might actually know something worth dying for. I've been mapping the tracking implants, he said without preamble. The ones they use to monitor us when we're off-site. They operate on a closed frequency, encrypted, but the encryption is Old Republic military code. I can break it. Why would you want to? But I already knew. Because if we can spoof the signal, we can move freely. The system thinks we're where we're supposed to be. but we're actually somewhere else. Now, Melwy. For what purpose? Even if we could disappear temporarily, we'd have to come back. They control the kava, the stims, everything we need to function. I've been weaning myself off, he said quietly, slowly, taking less each day, letting my body adjust. It's been hell, but it's possible. I stared at him. You're planning to run. I'm planning to be free. He met my eyes. And I know others who want the same thing. The Republic cell I mentioned, they're real. They've been extracting slaves for months. They have a ship. They have resources. They have a destination. But they need information. What kind of information? The kind you've been collecting. Transaction records. Account numbers. Proof of what the Hutts are really doing with their money. He leaned closer. They're not just running criminal enterprises anymore. They're funding something bigger. Imperial remnants maybe. Or something worse. The Republic cell thinks that if they can prove it, they can get New Republic intervention, cut off the Hutts' protection, bring down the whole structure. It was insane. It was impossible. It was offering me exactly what I'd stopped allowing myself to want. When? I asked. Ahiyan. 3 weeks. There's a transport window, a gap in patrol schedules. They'll send a ship. But we need to be ready. We need your data. We need spoofed implants. And we need to move fast once it starts. Nice growl. How many? 8 of us so far. Could be more if we can trust them. 8 people against a criminal empire that had operated for millennia. Dal. 8 slaves with spoofed implants and stolen data, hoping that somewhere in the galaxy, someone cared enough to act on what we could provide. I'm in, I said, because what else was there to say? The 9th fracture was preparation. Over the next 3 weeks, I lived in a state of controlled terror. Every morning when I took my kava, I knew it might be my last. Every shift at my data pad, I expected guards to appear and drag me away to whatever fate awaited traitors. Every moment was balanced on a knife's edge between hope and disaster. But I worked methodically, copied more data, encrypted it, hid it in personal files disguised as innocuous records. Kale provided me with a storage chip, military grade, no bigger than a fingernail. I loaded everything onto Eton, 5 years of observations, patterns in the cartel's finances, connections between accounts, evidence of transactions that suggested purposes beyond simple crime. I didn't know if it was enough. I didn't know if it mattered. I just knew it was all I could offer. Kale had been right about the implants. He'd somehow obtained an old encryption key, probably from the same Republic cell that was planning our extraction. He built a small device that could override the tracking signal for approximately 6 hours before the spoof would degrade and trigger alerts. 6 hours to get from wherever we were to the extraction point. 6 hours to become invisible. But the hardest part wasn't the technical preparation. It was the weaning. Kale had been doing it for months, gradually reducing his chemical intake, letting his body remember how to function without constant artificial support. I had 3 weeks to do the same thing. No, it was worse than I'd imagined. The first morning I skipped kava entirely. I lasted until 4th hour before the shake started. Not as bad as Tico's had been, but noticeable. Skorg looked at me once, his expression evaluating, and I forced myself to steady, to keep working, to show nothing but focus. I made myself drink half my usual amount for the next week. Then a quarter, then just a few sips, barely enough to stave off the worst symptoms. My body screamed for more. My hands trembled constantly. My focus deteriorated. My processing accuracy dropped 3%, earning me a minor reprimand. But I could function. Me. Barely. Miserably. But function. The stims were easier to reduce, just requested them less frequently, claiming improved focus, accepting the exhaustion as the cost of preparation. By the third week, I was running on almost nothing. Raw biology, unaugmented by chemicals, trying to remember how to sustain itself. Every day felt like walking through thick liquid. Every task required twice the effort. But I was doing it. We all were. 8 of us, scattered through the counting house, each quietly destroying our dependencies, each preparing to risk everything for the possibility of nothing. The 10th fracture was betrayal. The night before the planned extraction, Silene's replacement, a young human named Mara, who'd been assigned to her stashina, didn't show up for evening shift. She'd been part of our group, had committed to the plan, had received a spoofed implant. At first, we thought she was just late. Then we thought she'd gotten cold feet, abandoned the plan, but that would have been fine. We could proceed without her. Then, the guards came. Not the usual corridor guards or floor supervisors. Security enforcement. Armed. Led by a Trandoshan I'd seen before in the company of Gorga's major domo. They moved through the counting house with purpose, heading directly for specific stations. Kale's station. Nagadialer, Nabadi, Lordiwaye, Ra. 3 others. And mine, Moo. I felt everything go cold. Saw Kale look up, saw the calculation in his eyes, saw him reach for something, the spoof device probably, or maybe just anything that might help, but it was too late. They took us without ceremony. Binders, the real kind this time. Heavy durasteel instead of golden ornament. They confiscated our data pads, our personal items, everything. They marched us out of the counting house in full view of everyone else. A demonstration, a reminder of what happened when you stepped outside the system. Mara had told them, had traded our plan for leniency, or reward, or just the simple relief of not having to be afraid anymore. Had chosen to remain in the system, rather than risk escaping it. I didn't blame her. Not really. She'd done what the Hutts had trained her to do. Prioritize survival over solidarity. Choose the certain suffering over the uncertain alternative. But I hated her anyway. They took us to a detention level I'd never seen before, deep in the counting house's substructure. 1. Small cells, 3 meters by 3 meters, concrete walls, no windows, just a grate in the floor for waste, and a slot in the door for food delivery. They separated us. I didn't know where the others were, didn't know if they were alive, or being processed, or already disposed of. I just knew I was alone in a concrete box, waiting for whatever came next. It took 2 days. The 11th fracture was interrogation. They didn't torture me. That would have been crude, and the Hutts are never crude. Instead, they just stopped giving me kava. I'd been weaning myself for 3 weeks, had thought I was prepared, had believed I could handle the withdrawal. I was wrong. The first 6 hours were manageable. Uncomfortable, but manageable. 1. Shakes, nausea, anxiety. Nothing I hadn't experienced during preparation. The next 6 hours were worse. The shakes became convulsions. The nausea became vomiting, though there was nothing in my stomach to expel. The anxiety became full-blown panic, my mind screaming that something was terribly wrong, that I needed the chemical, needed it now, needed it more than air or water or hope. By the 18-hour mark, I was hallucinating. Seeing Silene on the platform edge. Seeing Tico screaming. Seeing the dead spice workers at their stations. Seeing my mother's face when she sold me. The relief in her eyes, the guilt beneath the relief. By the 30-hour mark, I would have done anything for a single sip of kava. That's when they sent the interrogator. He was human, middle-aged, wearing clothes that suggested wealth without flaunting it. He carried a medical case and a small cup of dark liquid that I recognized immediately. "My name is Jessen," he said, settling into a chair across from me. I was strapped to a bench, restrained at wrists and ankles. I work for Gorga the Hutt as a contract investigator. I'm here to help you. Help. I managed through chattering teeth. Yes. He held up the cup. This is Kava. Full dose, pharmaceutical grade. I can give it to you right now. All the discomfort stops. You feel normal again. All you have to do is talk to me. I tried to resist. Tried to remember why I'd endured this withdrawal, what I'd been preparing for. But my body was screaming, and the kava was right there, and he was offering it freely. What do you want to know? My voice sounded broken. Everything. The plan. The Republic cell. Your data collection. Who else is involved? Where the extraction was supposed to happen? What you were planning to do with the information you stole? He smiled gently. Tell me everything, and this all ends. You go back to your work, to your routine, to your life. This unpleasantness becomes just a bad memory. And if I don't, he set the cup down on a small table, just out of reach. Then we continue. Days, weeks, however long it takes. Your body will eventually stabilize, of course. The dependency isn't permanent if you push through it, but the process is unpleasant and unnecessary. Why suffer when you could simply cooperate? He was right. That was the horrible thing. Everything he said was true. I could end this instantly, could return to the bearable suffering of slavery instead of the unbearable suffering of withdrawal. And in that moment, I understood something about resistance. It's not a single choice, one dramatic moment of defiance. It's 1,000 small choices, each one requiring you to choose pain over relief, uncertainty over security, possibility over survival. I thought about Kale, wondering if he was enduring the same interrogation. Ow. Thought about the others in our group. Thought about the Republic cell that might or might not be real, that might or might not care, that might or might not be able to do anything with the information I'd gathered. Thought about Silene stepping off that platform. I don't know what you're talking about, I said. Jessen sighed. That's unfortunate, but expected. He stood, picked up the cup of kava, and walked to the door. We'll try again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Eventually, you'll remember. They always do. The door closed. The kava left with him. And I was alone with my body's betrayal. The 12th fracture was despair. 4 days. 4 days of withdrawal that felt like months, like years, like geological time. My body staging a full rebellion against the absence of chemicals it had been taught to require. Convulsions, hallucinations, fever. Pain in every joint, every muscle, every nerve. Jessen came twice daily with his cup of kava and his reasonable questions. Each time, I refused. Each time, it got harder. On the 5th day, something changed. The physical symptoms began to ease, my body finally remembering how to function without chemical support. The hallucinations faded. The convulsions stopped. But the psychological symptoms intensified. Without the kava, without the stims, without the carefully calibrated chemical support that had mediated my emotions for 5 years, I felt everything raw and unfiltered. And what I felt was horror. Horror at what I'd become. At what I'd accepted. At the years I'd spent as a biological processing unit for a criminal empire. The transactions I'd verified. The suffering I'd enabled. The system I'd helped perpetuate through my obedience. I'd been complicit. Well, that was the realization that broke me more completely than the withdrawal. Not forced, not blameless, complicit. I'd chosen, every day, to survive instead of resist. Had chosen to be a good slave instead of a dead rebel. And now, with 8 people caught because of our plan, with Mara having betrayed us, with the extraction certainly cancelled, and the Republic cell probably compromised, what had my tiny rebellion accomplished, except to make everything worse? On the 6th day, when Jessen arrived, I told him everything. Not because of the kava he still carried, not because of the withdrawal, just because it seemed pointless to hold out any longer. The plan was already ruined. The others were already caught. My silence was accomplishing nothing, except extending my suffering. So I talked. Told him about Kale, about the spoofed implants, about the data collection, about the Republic Cell's supposed plans. I gave him everything except the location of the data chippa that I'd hidden too well, had encoded too carefully, and some small stubborn part of me refused to surrender it. Jessen listened, recorded everything, nodded with what seemed like genuine sympathy. "Thank you," he said when I finished. "I know that was difficult. You did the right thing." Did I? My voice was hollow. E.Q. Yes. Resistance is admirable in fiction. In reality, it's just suffering that achieves nothing. He stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, you were always going to fail. The Hutts have been doing this for thousands of years. They've seen every form of resistance, crushed every rebellion, outlasted every government that opposed them. You were 8 slaves with a plan. They are an empire with infrastructure. The mathematics were never in your favor. Then why do you work for them?" I asked. He smiled. Because the mathematics aren't in my favor either. We all serve something. Moo. I just chose to serve the entity most likely to survive. After he left, I waited for them to return me to the counting house, to my station, to my routine. Waited for the punishment, the adjustment, the consequence that would serve as warning to others. Instead, they moved me. The 13th fracture was Sale. I'd been valuable to Gorga as a processor, trained, reliable, chemically controlled, economically productive. But I'd become more valuable as an example, and examples are wasted if kept hidden. They cleaned me up, refitted my golden chains, administered medical treatment to address the physical damage from withdrawal, made me presentable. Then they put me on the market. Not the private markets where slaves are bought for specific purposes. The public auction houses, where flesh is displayed for mass consumption, where the desperate are paraded before the callous, where slavery performs its own justification through the mechanism of commerce. The auction house was in the mid-levels, a sprawling complex that processed hundreds of sales daily. Humans, aliens, droids, anything that could be owned was bought and sold here. The smell was the worst part. Unwashed bodies, cheap disinfectant, fear manifesting as sweat and other fluids. They kept us in holding pens until our auction slots. I was in a pen with 40 others, all of us scheduled for the evening exhibition when the wealthier buyers attended. A Twi'lek woman tried to speak to me, asking how long I'd been enslaved, but I couldn't answer, couldn't engage. I was watching something inside me shut down, some last remnant of personhood folding in on itself to escape what was happening. When they called my number, guards led me onto a platform in front of approximately 300 potential buyers. Human, Hutt, Quarren, Rhodian, others I couldn't identify in the harsh lights. All of them evaluating me with the same expression. Calculating value. The auctioneer was a Biff, his voice amplified through the hall's speakers. Lot 4771. Human female, age 15 standard years, 5 years experience in financial processing, trained in accounting and audit procedures, excellent numeracy scores, chemically stabilized, minimal health issues. Opening bid at 6,000 credit. They were selling my skills, my training, my years of servitude as credentials that made me valuable. I was a product with specifications, being marketed to entities that measured worth and utility. The bidding was brisk. Counting house managers looking for experienced processors, crime lords seeking financial administrators, spiced and operators needing inventory management. My price climbed. 7,000, 9,000. A Hutt I didn't recognize, smaller than Gorga, younger perhaps, made a bid of 12,000. The auctioneer's excitement was audible. High-value sale meant high commission. But then, a new voice. Human, speaking from the back of the hall. 20,000 credits. The crowd stirred. That was well above market value for a slave of my category. The hut made a counter bid. $22,000. 30,000, the human voice said. Silence. At that price, I cost more than most land speeders, more than some starships. The hut made a gesture of withdrawal, unwilling to engage in what had become economically irrational bidding. Sold, the auctioneer declared, to bidder 739 for 30,000 credits. Transaction complete. They removed me from the platform, processed the paperwork, transferred my ownership. I didn't see my new owner during any of this. All transactions were handled through intermediaries, maintaining the fiction that slavery was a business like any other, impersonal and efficient. Only when I was being led out of the auction house did I see her. Human woman, maybe 40 standard years, wearing clothes that suggested neither wealth nor poverty. She looked at me, and her expression was complicated, Assad, determined, angry at something larger than the immediate moment. Come with me, she said quietly, and don't speak until we're somewhere private. How? The 14th fracture was freedom, though I didn't understand it as such at first. She led me through Nar Shaddah's corridors, moving with purpose, occasionally checking behind us but not frantically. We took 3 different turbolifts, crossed through public markets, entered a residential sector I'd never seen before. Eventually, we reached a small apartment, clean but sparse. She ushered me inside, locked the door, and activated some kind of security device that hummed softly. Then she removed my chains. Not unlocked them on, removed them. She had the codes, the tools, the authorization. The golden binders that had been on my wrists for 5 years opened and fell away. I stared at my bare wrists. They looked wrong, incomplete. I'd grown so accustomed to the weight that its absence felt like amputation. My name is Sarah Corin, the woman said. I work with the Republic Restoration Society. We're the ones who've been buying and freeing slaves across Nar Shaddaa. She gestured to a chair. Sit. I imagine you have questions. I sat. My mind was moving through thick liquid, trying to process what was happening. Why? Because slavery is wrong. Because the Hutts have operated with impunity for too long. Because someone has to. She sat across from me. We heard about your group. About the attempted extraction. You all did me kinds. We couldn't reach you in time, The cartel moved too fast. But we'd already identified you as potentially valuable. Your data collection hadn't gone unnoticed. No. So I told them everything, I said quietly. I broke. I gave them the plan. I know. We expected you would. They're very good at interrogation, and you're 15 years old with 5 years of chemical conditioning. We don't judge you for that. She leaned forward. But you didn't give them the data chip. We know because they've been searching the counting house extensively. Where is it? I'd hidden it in the base of my workstation, secured in a magnetic clamp underneath the repulsor cushion. They'd have to disassemble the entire station to find it. And even then, they'd need to know to look for something so small. Why should I tell you? I asked. How do I know you're actually what you claim? You don't. You have no reason to trust me. I'm another person making promises, and you've learned that promises mean nothing. She pulled out a datapad, showed me a set of coordinates. This is a Republic outpost in the Outer Rim. No. Small, barely operational, but legitimate. We have a ship leaving tomorrow that can take you there. Or you can choose somewhere else. Or you can stay here. You're legally free now. I processed the manumission documents. You're no longer anyone's property. Just like that? Just like that. Though freedom is more complicated than just removing chains. She set the data pad down. The data you collect, if it's what we think it is, it could help us build a case for New Republic intervention. The Hutts are funding something significant, something that threatens more than just Nar Shaddaa. But we need proof. We need your data. I thought about this. About Kale and the others, still imprisoned somewhere in the counting house. About Silene stepping off that platform. About Tico's empty eyes. About 5 years of processing other people's money, watching the machinery of oppression convert suffering into profit. I'll get you the data, I said. But I want something in return. Name it, entrenched. The others, the ones who were caught, I want them freed too. Syrah's expression tightened. That's difficult. They're being held in secure detention. They're considered security risks now, valuable property that's demonstrated behavioral issues. The price for their release would be extreme and our resources are limited. Then use my data as leverage. Trade it for them. If we do that, we lose the evidence. We can't use it to build a case against the Hutts if we've already given it to them. Then find another way. I don't care how. I'm not giving you anything until they're safe. I stood up, and despite everything, despite the withdrawal, the interrogation, the auction, the years of conditioned Gamami voice was steady. I've spent 5 years helping the Hutts profit from suffering. I'm not going to help you do the same thing, even if your intentions are better. All of them go free, or you get nothing. Dan Noel. Pun. She studied me for a long moment. You understand that we might not be able to save everyone? That some of them might already be gone, sold, processed, disposed of? Then save whoever you can. And if we can't save any of them, then you've lost access to data that could apparently threaten Hutt operations across the sector. Your choice. Syrah smiled slightly. You're tougher than the interrogation report suggested. The interrogation report saw what the Hutts expected to see. They're very good at creating what they want to see. Fair enough. She stood, moved to a comm unit. I'll need to contact my superiors. This isn't a decision I can make alone. It might take a day or two. I've got time. For the first time in 5 years, I've got nothing but time. The 15th fracture was waiting. Syrah's apartment became my temporary refuge. She gave me a room, provided food that wasn't nutrition paste, left me alone when I needed solitude. She didn't push, didn't demand, didn't try to extract promises or commitments. She just let me exist. And for the first 2 days, I didn't know what to do with that. I'd been scheduled, controlled, directed for so long that unstructured time felt like falling. I'd wake without an alarm, panic that I'd missed my shift, then remember I didn't have a shift anymore. I'd feel hunger, reflexively wait for the designated meal time, then realize I could eat whenever I chose. The absence of the kava was strange. My body had finally adjusted to functioning without it, but I felt its absence like a missing tooth hat, constantly aware of the gap. Sometimes I'd find myself craving it not for the chemical effect, but for the ritual, the routine, the certainty of that morning cup. This was what freedom felt like, uncomfortable, uncertain, and terrifying in ways that slavery never was. Slavery, at least, provided structure. Freedom required you to build your own. On the 3rd day, Syrah's comm activated. She spoke quietly with someone, then disconnected, and looked at me. We've made progress. 4 of your group are accounted for and can be extracted. The other 3, she paused. 1 was sold 2 days ago, buyer unknown. 1 is in medical treatment for complications from interrogation. 1 is... She didn't finish, but I understood. Kale. And your tea. I knew somehow that she was talking about Kale, the one who'd had a plan, who'd believed in possibility, who'd thought 8 slaves could matter against an empire. Dead? I asked. The details aren't clear, but he's not available for extraction. I felt something crack inside me, but it was a different kind of breaking than before. Not the breaking of surrender, but the breaking that comes before transformation. Grief and rage mixing into something new. Something that felt like fuel. The four who can be extracted, do it. Whatever it costs, whoever you have to pay, whatever deals you have to make, get them out. And your data? I told her where to find it, how to retrieve it, how to decrypt the files I'd encoded. Gave her everything I'd collected over 5 years of observation. Account numbers, transaction patterns, connections between legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises. Evidence of funds flowing to imperial remnants, operating in the unknown regions. It might be enough. It might be nothing. But it was all I had to trade for 4 lives. It'll take a week to arrange the extractions, Sarah said. They'll have to be careful, use intermediaries, make it look like normal property transfers. But we'll get them out. And then? And then we use your data to make noise. Loud noise. Noise. We can't take down the Hut cartel. No one can. But we can expose enough of their operations to make things uncomfortable. New Republic officials who've been looking the other way will have to acknowledge what's happening. Trade restrictions might follow. Financial investigations. Maybe even intervention. No. That won't free anyone, I said. That won't stop the counting houses or the spice dens or the pleasure houses. That won't undo 5 years of my life or Silene's death or whatever they did to Kale. No, Sarah agreed. It won't. But it might make the next 5 years harder for the Huts. Might save some people who haven't been caught yet. Might create enough disruption that a few more can slip through the cracks. She looked at me steadily. This isn't a story where the hero destroys evil and everyone lives happily ever after. This is reality, where small victories are all we get. And we have to decide whether small victories are worth fighting for. I thought about this. About mathematics and probabilities. About 8 slaves, with a plan against an empire with infrastructure. About how resistance always fails but somehow has to continue anyway. What happens to me? I asked. Whatever you want. You're free, legally and actually. You can take passage to the Republic outpost, try to build a life there. You can stay on Nar Shaddaa. It's dangerous, but it's what you know. You can go anywhere a ship can reach. She paused. Or, you can work with us. We can always use people who understand how the Huts operate, who've seen the system from inside. People who are angry enough to fight, but smart enough to fight carefully. Nice. You're recruiting me. I'm offering an option. You've spent 5 years being property. I imagine you'd like to spend some time being a problem. The 16th fracture was choice. I took the job. No, do I see? No, Jay. Not immediately, He spent 2 weeks at the Republic outpost in the Outer Rim, recovering, adjusting, learning to exist without chains. They provided counseling, medical care, education opportunities. Tried to give me tools for building a normal life. But normal life felt impossible. I'd sit in their clean facilities, surrounded by people who'd never been slaves, who'd never processed the mechanics of oppression, who lived in the comfortable certainty that freedom was the natural state of being. And I couldn't connect with any of it. Couldn't imagine myself in their world, doing ordinary work, living an ordinary life, pretending that what I'd seen and been didn't matter. So I contacted Sira. She told her I wanted in. She wasn't surprised. They trained me not in violence. I wasn't built for that, but in the skills I already had. Data analysis, pattern recognition, financial investigation. They showed me how to track money flows across sectors, how to identify shell corporations and front businesses, how to map criminal networks through their economic infrastructure. I was good at it. Better than good. I'd spent 5 years watching the cartel's operations from inside, had developed an instinct for the subtle patterns that indicated hidden purposes. I could look at a transaction record and see the story beneath it, could follow threads that others missed, could build cases from fragments. And I was motivated. Every analysis I completed, every network I exposed, every operation I helped disrupt it was a small payment against an impossible debt. Couldn't free the people I'd left behind, couldn't undo the years I'd spent enabling the system, but I could make the Huts work harder, could throw sand in their machinery. Could be a problem. Wow. We freed 43 slaves over the next 2 years, bought them legally, extracted them carefully, helped them disappear into new lives. It was expensive, slow, and ultimately meaningless against the scale of Hut operations. They enslaved thousands in the same period we freed dozens. But we freed those dozens. That had to matter. The data I provided led to a new Republic investigation into Hut financial activities. It went nowhere and too much political complication. Too many officials who'd taken cartel money. Too much economic integration between criminal and legitimate commerce. The Republic issued stern statements and minor sanctions, and the Huts adjusted their operations slightly and continued as before. But the investigation created disruption, made the cartel more cautious, more paranoid. They tightened security, which created inefficiencies. They purged suspected informants, which created resentment. They increased costs for protection and enforcement, which squeezed their profit margins just slightly. Small victories. The only kind available. Now, I never went back to Nar Shaddaa. Couldn't. Hold it. The tracking implant was still in my body. Removing it would require surgery I couldn't afford and carried risks I wasn't ready to take. If I returned to the moon, the Hut's systems would identify me instantly, and my freedom would end with efficiency and finality. So I operated remotely, analyzed data from outposts and safe houses, built cases and maps and target lists, helped others execute extractions I couldn't participate in, became a name in reports, a source of information, a person who existed mainly as data patterns and encrypted communications. It was lonely. It was necessary. It was the only way to survive what I'd survived while still being able to look at my reflection. On the 3rd anniversary of my freedom, I received an encrypted message through Republic Restoration channels. It contained a single file. A recording, audio only, poor quality, captured through means I didn't want to know about. The voice was Cal's. He was alive. Barely. The recording was from a deep-level detention facility beneath one of the major Hut palaces on Nar Shaddaa. He'd been sold not for execution, but for something worse, experimental property, used to test new control mechanisms, new chemical dependencies, new methods of breaking resistant slaves. He was speaking, but the words didn't make sense. Just fragments, repeated phrases, numbers, responses to prompts I couldn't hear. They'd burned out his mind, turned him into exactly what Gorga had turned Tico into, a biological machine that performed functions without understanding them. The recording ended with a note from our extraction team. No recovery possible. Subject has been processed beyond rehabilitation. Recommend termination on compassionate grounds if opportunity arises. I listened to it 7 times, trying to find some trace of the person who'd believed 8 slaves could matter, who'd thought resistance was possible, who'd smiled that genuine smile in the counting house meal hall. Nothing. Nothing. Just empty voice patterns, consciousness erased, person converted to function. I never listened to it again. I see. I still to it again. But I kept the file. Stored securely, encrypted carefully. Because forgetting would be worse. Because someone should know what the Huts do to those who resist. Because Kale deserved to be remembered as he was, not as they'd made him. The 17th fracture was understanding. 5 years after my freedom, I'd become something I never intended, an expert on slavery. Organizations consulted me, asked me to speak about the mechanics of control, to explain how the Huts maintained their systems. They wanted to understand so they could fight it, so they could build better interventions, so they could create change. And I told them the truth they didn't want to hear. You can't fight it. Not really. Not in any way that matters. The Huts had been refining their control mechanisms for millennia. They'd outlasted governments, survived wars, adapted to every economic and political shift the galaxy had experienced. They survived because they understood something fundamental. Slavery isn't maintained through violence alone. Violence is expensive, inefficient, creates resistance. True slavery is maintained through complexity, through layers of control so numerous and interconnected that removing one doesn't free the slave. It just makes them dependent on different systems. Chemical dependencies, economic traps, social hierarchies, manufactured needs, psychological conditioning, legal structures, legal structures, cultural normalizations. You can free individual slaves, we'd proven that. You can disrupt individual operations. You can expose civic atrocities. But the system adapts. The Huts simply adjust their methods, find new mechanisms, rebuild what you've damaged with resources you can't match. And the worst part, the thing I struggle to articulate without sounding defeatist, most slaves don't want violent revolution. They want incremental improvement. They want the system to be slightly less terrible, because a slightly less terrible system is survivable, and survival is all they have the energy to imagine. I'd been that person, had accepted my golden chains because they were prettier than steel ones, had competed for privileges instead of uniting for freedom, had processed transactions and taken my kava and convinced myself that being a good slave was better than being a dead rebel. The Huts understood this. They engineered it. They created systems where the oppressed police themselves, where escape seems more frightening than endurance, where hope is calibrated to be just strong enough to prevent despair, but too weak to inspire action. So what do we do? People would ask after I'd explained all this. If we can't win, why fight? And I'd tell them, because the alternative is complicity. Because small victories matter to the people they save, even if they don't dismantle the system. Because every slave freed is a person who gets to experience being human again. Now, because the Huts want us to believe resistance is pointless, and believing them serves their interests more than fighting them ever could. No. It wasn't a satisfying answer. But it was the only honest one I had. The 18th fracture was unexpected. 7 years after my freedom, I received intelligence about a counting house in the Corellian sector. Financial irregularities, possible embezzlement, a floor supervisor who might be skimming. Standard investigation, but when I pulled the location data, my hands stopped moving. It was Gorga's counting house. My counting house. The place where I'd spent 5 years at Station 3-4, processing billions of credits, wearing golden chains, drinking kava every morning. The supervisor suspected of skimming was Skorg. The Wike who'd shown me processing tricks, wow, who'd watched Tico's tremors and called the guards, who'd supervised us all with detached efficiency, neither cruel nor kind, just functional. The evidence suggested he'd been stealing small amounts for years, tiny percentages shaved from transactions, amounts too small to trigger individual alerts, but substantial in aggregate. He'd accumulated almost 90,000 credits in hidden accounts. He was using it to buy slaves and free them. Not through official channels like the Republic Restoration Society. Just quietly purchasing contracts of slaves nearing breakdown. Slaves who reminded him of Tico or Silene. Slaves who wouldn't survive much longer in the system. He'd buy them, forge manumission documents, give them false identities, and enough money to leave Nar Shaddaa. He'd freed 11 people. It had taken him 6 years, and most of his accumulated wealth. And now the Huts were investigating. And when they confirmed the theft, which they would, the evidence was clear. They would do to him what they'd done to Xavar, or worse. I sat with this information for 3 days, trying to decide what to do with it. I could tell the Republic Restoration Society, ask them to extract Skorg before the Hutts acted. But that would require resources, create risks, and Skorg had been a willing participant in the slavery system. He'd enforced it, profited from it, watched people break and done nothing. That he'd also tried to save some didn't erase what he'd enabled. Or, I could do nothing. Let the Hutts handle their internal security matters. Wah. Let Skorg face the consequences of theft, regardless of his motivations. Or I could warn him. You may know, but you mentioned, or you wanna Mr. I could warn him. I contacted him through anonymous channels, a message that couldn't be traced back to me or the society. Told him his accounts had been flagged, that he had maybe 72 hours before they moved against him, that he should run if he valued his hands and his life. I don't know if he received it. I don't know if he ran. Wah. I never followed up, never checked what happened to him. But I'd given him the same thing Syrah had given me. A choice. The rest was his problem. The 19th fracture was philosophical. 10 years after my freedom, I was 25 standard years old and had spent more of my life fighting slavery than being enslaved. I'd helped extract over 200 people, had provided intelligence that led to dozens of cartel operation disruptions, had trained others in analysis techniques that made them more effective at their work. I was good at what I did, respected within the Republic Restoration Society, trusted with sensitive operations, compensated fairly, earned more in a year than I'd earned in 5 years as a slave, enough to live comfortably, even save. And I was profoundly unhappy, because every person we freed, every operation we disrupted, every small victory we achieved, existed against a backdrop of overwhelming loss. For every slave we extracted, thousands remained in chains. For every Hutt operation we damaged, 10 more continued smoothly. For every person who escaped, another entered the system to replace them. We were bailing water from a sinking ship with a broken cup and calling it progress. A colleague, a former Twi'lek slave named Vorin, who'd been with the society longer than me, noticed my declining morale. He took me to a quiet cafe in a Republic outpost, bought me actual kafa no kava, never kavat, asked what was wrong. I told him, we're not winning, we can't win. The mathematics don't work, we're just performing resistance, making ourselves feel better by doing something, even though that something doesn't actually change anything fundamental. Vorin listened, then said, you're right. We're not going to destroy the Hutt cartel. We're not going to end slavery. The system is too big, too entrenched, too profitable. We can't win. Then, why do you keep doing this? Because I remember what it felt like when someone bought my freedom. When someone I'd never met, who owed me nothing, who gained nothing from helping me, chose to do it anyway. He met my eyes. You can't save everyone, but you can save someone. And to that someone, you're their entire universe changing. That has to be enough, because it's all we have. But it doesn't scale. Individual salvation doesn't address systemic oppression. No, it doesn't. But you know what else doesn't address systemic oppression? Despair. Inaction. Accepting that because we can't fix everything, we shouldn't fix anything. He leaned back. The Hutts want you to think this way. Want you to see the scale of the problem and give up. Want you to believe that small actions don't matter. Wasu. Because if you believe that, you stop acting, and their system continues without resistance. No. So we just keep going? Keep saving droplets from the ocean? Keep pretending it matters? We keep going because the alternative is becoming what we survived. We keep going because every person we free gets to live a life instead of being a resource. We keep going because small actions accumulate, because systems have tipping points, because change happens through countless tiny acts of resistance that seem meaningless until suddenly they aren't. He smiled. And we keep going because we're still angry, and anger is fuel, and we'd rather burn ourselves out fighting than fade away accepting. I thought about this. Money, about Silene and Tico and Kale and Mara and Skorg, and all the others whose names I had never learned, whose faces I couldn't forget. About 5 years at station, 3, 4, and 10 years, trying to make those years mean something. Anger isn't sustainable, I said quietly. No. But purpose is. Haini Kano. And you have to decide what your purpose is going to be. Whether surviving what you survived means hiding from it, or whether it means ensuring that your survival serves something larger than yourself. The 20th fracture was acceptance. I didn't have an epiphany. Didn't wake up one day with renewed conviction and perfect clarity about my purpose. I just kept working, because working was better than not working, because helping was better than not helping, because being a problem for the Hutts was better than accepting their worldview. But I changed my relationship with the work. Stopped measuring success by systemic change and started measuring it by individual impact. Stopped thinking about destroying the cartel and started thinking about disrupting their comfort. Stopped expecting the work to fill the hole that 5 years of slavery had carved into my psyche, and started accepting that some holes don't fill up, they just become part of your shape. I worked with the Republic Restoration Society for another 8 years. Freed more people, disrupted more operations, built more cases. Some led to minor interventions. Most led to nowhere. All of it mattered to someone, even if that someone was just me. On the 18th anniversary of my freedom, I received a message from an unknown sender. It contained no text, just a file image of a woman I didn't immediately recognize. Human, maybe 30 years old, standing in front of what looked like a small business. A restaurant based on the signage. It took me 3 minutes to place her face. Mara Jadumar. The girl who'd betrayed our escape plan, who'd traded our freedom for her security, who I'd hated with desperate intensity before learning that hate was just another form of bondage. She'd survived. Had been freed somehow, Bought by the society, perhaps, or by another organization, or maybe had earned manumission through years of perfect service. She'd left Nar Shaddaa, started over, built something. The message that accompanied the image was brief. I know you probably hate me. I don't blame you. But I wanted you to know that I made it out eventually. That I'm trying to be better than I was. That I think about what happened and wish I'd been braver. Thank you for not giving up, even after I did. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling things I couldn't name. Not forgiveness, I wasn't sure I had that to offer. Not quite reconciliation, Too much damage, too much time. But something like understanding. Maybe recognition that we'd all been trapped in an impossible system, all making choices that were terrible and necessary, all surviving the only ways we knew how. I didn't respond. Didn't know what to say. But I kept the image, filed it with the recording of Kale, and the reports about Silene, and all the other fragments of people the system had broken. Evidence. Testimony. Die. Proof that it all happened, that we all existed, that our suffering and survival and small acts of resistance meant something, even if only to each other. The 21st fracture was return. Nay, 20 years after my freedom, I went back to Nar Shaddaa. It was monumentally stupid. The tracking implant was still in my body. I'd never had it removed, partially because of surgical risks, partially because removing it felt like erasing evidence of what had been done to me. If the Hutt's systems were still active, still monitoring, they'd identify me the moment I entered their scanning range. But I needed to see it. Needed to know if the counting house still stood, if Gorga still operated, if anything had changed, or if the machine just continued grinding forward, indifferent to the passage of time. I went in disguise, using forged credentials, moving carefully through the sectors I'd once known. The moon had changed in small ways, different businesses, different crowds, different layers of grime accumulating on endless surfaces. But fundamentally, it was identical. Still, the smuggler's moon. Still consuming people, still converting desperation into profit with mechanical efficiency. The counting house was exactly where I'd left it. Same building, same flickering signage, same entrance guards. I didn't go inside and couldn't risk that, but I watched from across the corridor, observing the workers entering for their shifts. They looked like I'd looked. Golden chains, careful expressions. The particular posture of people who've learned to make themselves small. I Koshu. They filed in with practiced efficiency, disappeared into the building, began another 12-hour shift processing other people's wealth. Nothing had changed. 20 years of my work, hundreds of slaves freed, dozens of operations disrupted, countless hours of analysis and resistance, and refusing to accept that this was how things had to be at. And nothing had fundamentally changed. The counting house still operated. Gorga still profited. Slaves still wore golden chains and drank kava every morning, and processed transactions with chemical-mediated efficiency. I should have felt despair. Should have seen this as confirmation that Vorin was wrong. That small actions didn't accumulate. That the mathematics really were impossible. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Peace. Because I'd tried. Because some people had gone free who wouldn't have otherwise. Because I'd refused to be a good slave, even when being a good slave would have been easier. Because the Hutts hadn't won, not completely, not in the ways that mattered. They still controlled the system. But they didn't control me. The 22nd fracture was memory. I'm 35 standard years old now. 24 years since Sarah removed my chains. 24 years of freedom that still feels uncertain, still feels borrowed, still feels like something that might be revoked if I'm not careful. I still work with the Republic Restoration Society, though in a reduced capacity. Train others mostly, share what I know, help coordinate operations I'm too old and too damaged to execute personally. I never married, never had children, never built the kind of normal life that the outpost counselors tried to prepare me for. Some kinds of damage don't heal. They just become permanent features of your architecture, load-bearing structures you build your life around rather than trying to remove. I still don't drink kava. Can't. The smell alone triggers responses I can't control. Shaking, nausea, memories that surface with violent clarity. I've tried other hot beverages, other morning rituals, but nothing replaces it. There's just a gap where that habit used to be, and I've learned to live with the gap. I still dream about the counting house, about Station 3-4, and the flickering datapad, and the soft tapping of 43 styluses moving in rhythm like rain, about Skorg, and Tico, and Silene, about the hum of the processing equipment bleeding through the walls, about Kale's smile before they broke him. The dreams aren't always nightmares. Sometimes they're just memories, neutral and observational. My subconscious replaying data like the processor I was trained to be. Sometimes I wake from them feeling nothing except a vague sense of having been somewhere familiar. This troubles me more than the nightmares. The nightmares at least confirm that what happened was wrong. The neutral dreams suggest my mind has accepted it as simply something that occurred. Value neutral. Just part of my history. Maybe that's healing. Maybe that's surrender. Maybe there's no difference. All one. I keep notes, like I kept them in the counting house. Not about cartel operations, no. I'm too far removed from active intelligence gathering. Just personal observations, thoughts about control and freedom, and the space between them. Reflections on the people I've helped, and the people I couldn't help, and the mathematics of trying to measure impact against scale. These notes might become something eventually. A testimony, maybe. A record. Something future people could read if they want to understand what slavery actually feels like from inside. stripped of the dramatic narratives and heroic framings. Just the daily reality of being a biological resource in someone else's system, and the complicated work of surviving that, and the stranger work of surviving the survival. The 23rd fracture is ongoing. There's no neat ending to this story. No final confrontation with Gorga, no dramatic liberation of the counting house, no moment where everything clicks into place and makes sense. The huts still operate. Nar Shaddaa still consumes people. Slaves still wear chains, golden and otherwise, and process their servitude through mechanisms so sophisticated that resistance seems impossible, and acceptance seems logical. And people like me still fight it. Imperfectly, insufficiently. With anger and exhaustion, and the knowledge that we're performing a kind of theater where the audience is ourselves, and the purpose is simply refusing to accept that this is how things have to be. The Republic Restoration Society still functions, though it's changed names and structures several times as political conditions shift. We freed over 2,000 people, no odd, meaningless number against the scale of hut operations, but 2,000 specific lives that went differently because someone intervened. Some of those people thrived, built new lives, found purpose, became whole in ways slavery had prevented. Others struggled, carrying damage that freedom couldn't heal, surviving but not quite living. A few went back, the conditioning too deep, the freedom too frightening, the familiar horror preferable to the uncertain alternative. I don't judge them for this. I understand it. There were days when I almost went back myself, when the weight of agency felt heavier than the weight of chains, when I wanted someone to just tell me what to do and remove the burden of choice. But I didn't go back. And most days, that feels like victory enough. The 24th fracture is transmission. I'm writing this because someone should know. Because the official records of slavery reduce it to economics and statistics, to property values and transaction volumes, to abstract discussions of labor systems and historical inevitabilities. But slavery isn't abstract. It's the smell of kava, and the weight of golden chains, and the sound of styluses tapping in rhythm. It's Tico's tremors and Silene's last step, and Kale's voice reduced to programmed responses. It's the way your mind adapts to horror, until the horror becomes normal, until you measure success by the quality of your servitude, rather than the possibility of your freedom. It's the sophisticated engineering of human consciousness, the systematic conversion of persons into resources, the creation of systems so complex and self-reinforcing that they operate almost automatically, requiring minimal violence, because the violence has been internalized, automated, made participatory. The huts understand control better than anyone in the galaxy. They've refined it over millennia, built it into economic structures and cultural assumptions, and the fundamental architecture of how commerce operates in the outer rim and beyond. They've made slavery so integral to the system that opposing it seems naive, impractical, economically illiterate. And they're winning. They've always been winning. They'll probably always be winning. But they haven't won. Not completely. Not. Because I'm here, writing this, free in ways I never thought possible. Because 2,000 people are living lives they weren't supposed to have. Because Skorga maybe, possibly got my warning and ran before they took his hands. Because every day, somewhere, someone chooses resistance over compliance, even knowing the mathematics don't favor them. Small victories, insufficient victories, but victories nonetheless. The 25th fracture is conclusion, except there is no conclusion. I'm still alive, still free, still fighting in small ways against a system too large to defeat. Still measuring my life not by what I've achieved, but by what I've refused to accept. The golden chains are gone, but I feel their weight every day. That's the thing about slavery, Removing the chains doesn't remove the mechanism. The conditioning persists, the damage remains, the reflexes that kept you alive in servitude continue operating long after servitude ends. I still flinch at raised voices. Wow, still feel anxiety in unstructured time. Still, calculate the cost of everything in terms of obligations and debts. Still, measure my worth by my utility. Still struggle to believe that my existence might have value independent of my function. This is what the huts do. This is how they control. Not just through chains and chemicals and debts, but through fundamentally restructuring how you understand yourself in relation to the world. They make you complicit in your own oppression, make you police yourself more effectively than any guard could, make you forget that you were ever supposed to be anything other than a resource. And even knowing this, even spending 24 years in freedom, even helping hundreds of others escape, still struggle against the programming. Still feel the pull of systems I know are designed to exploit me. Still default to obedience when uncertainty arises. Maybe that never goes away. Maybe that's just permanent now, a feature of who I am, shaped by 5 years at Station 3-4 in Gorga's counting house. But I'm not at Station 3-4 anymore. I'm soused. I'm not processing transactions, not drinking kava, not wearing chains. I'm writing this testimony because I choose to, because someone should know, because silence serves the huts more than speech ever could. This is how the huts control their slaves, through layers of sophisticated dependency, through economic traps and chemical conditioning, through social systems that make resistance seem impossible and compliance seem logical, through the creation of circumstances where slavery becomes the path of least resistance, and freedom becomes the truly radical choice. This is what it feels like from inside, like drowning slowly, like being digested, like participating in your own erasure while knowing exactly what's happening but lacking the tools to stop it. This is what survival looks like, imperfect, incomplete, still carrying the weight of what you survived, still fighting battles that might never end, still existing in the space between victory and defeat, where most actual human experience occurs. This is what I want people to know. The huts are winning. They've always been winning. And we fight them anyway, because the alternative is letting them win unopposed, and some of us can't live with that. Small victories against impossible odds. It's all we have. It's enough.